So again, we've talked mostly about newspapers this semester, and so I wanted to talk a little more about broadcasting. Um, a lot of the things, especially as it refers to research, um, are essentially the same as far as gatekeeping. You have different titles. You may have a director instead of an editor, so forth. But essentially the gatekeeping procedures are pretty similar, mostly more psychological and sociological in nature than procedural in lots of ways. Although, as he mentioned, it's such a time-consuming process to take a story of consequence anyway through that process. Um, so as he mentioned, um, a broadcast story, you have basically about 12 paragraphs, whereas in a newspaper, you might have three, even four times that much, even more than that sometimes. But his point is that, having experienced both, being a Pulitzer Prize winner in newspaper writing, and then going to be the top, I'm not sure if the top, or you have to say maybe the only investigative reporter for a national network at the time, that he found out that really it was even more difficult to write for broadcasting because you had to tell the entire story in those 12 paragraphs, which meant every word or every sentence was like writing the lead in a newspaper story. That's the hardest and most important sentence in a newspaper story. But because you have to shorten, it's harder to write short than it is long, is what it comes down to. If you're going to try to tell something and give as much, the most important information about something in 12 paragraphs as opposed to 36 paragraphs, that's harder, not easier. It's fewer words, but you have to really think about how to make it as precise at the same time as concise and complete as possible. And so that's one of his main points. Um, Another thing that we have talked about is understanding how important the sound is. The video helps you feel like you're there, and so that's to the viewer. They think that's the most important, and it is very important. But without the sound, what do you have? I think that it's significant. For example, when we watched a video by the Pulitzer Center associate director who talked about if you're planning your documentary film, think about how you could tell the story visually without any words, which of course is almost impossible. But nonetheless, that was her challenge: was to think through your story and think how well you could communicate a story if you had no words at all. And then you get that footage, that video, and then of course you do get to say words. Do get to conduct interviews and so forth, but the visuals are in a sense very separate from, and so the better you can tell the story with the visuals, that's the better your story is, certainly. But ultimately, it's the sound that really tells the details of the story, and if you don't do the sound well, um, then you've defeated yourself. He talked about the 2,000-pound pencil, and again, that is not the weight of the old-time broadcast cameras. It's the whole process of doing it. He mentioned, for example, that for his 4-minute story on all the illegal El Salvadoran refugees to America, or immigrants to America, that that first off, they spent basically the whole week doing it, but they recorded 10 to 12 hours worth of video for a 4-minute story. And sometimes they spent, over an hour for something that would take 6 seconds in that final story, trying to make it as perfect as possible. And then, as he was saying, again, the typical TV news coverage is maybe 8 to 10 stories, whereas a newspaper can have far more than that. Depending obviously in the advertising. Nowadays, advertising is hurting, so they have fewer stories. And so that's a problem for newspapers, is that they're having to cut back and cut back. So it's not as big a difference anymore as it used to be, but still, you would figure, if you have a really tight news hole, you're still going to have, um, you know, 5 times as many stories in your newspaper as you would have on the TV news, and so consequently, you can afford to carry some stories that the TV just can't carry. The TV has to wait for that story to develop and become important enough to make it to its front page, so to speak. My recorder is turning me off, I think. I don't know why. But anyway, so with the internet version, again, I've mentioned this before, but it's kind of ironic in that we've become so used to short stories on the internet that on the one hand, the internet allows us to run just as much as we want to. I mean, there's hardly any cost to putting even an entire book on the internet. On my website, I think I put like 100 books on my website, and it doesn't cost me anything. So I mean, in the website, the space is almost, for all intents and purposes, infinite, and so you can put a lot more, but readers don't want to read more. They want short stories on the internet, and so the advantage, and again, if I were to make suggestions to daily newspapers or to TV, they should have much more available on their website, because certainly the cost is not there. And the only way to survive, I believe, first off, the only way to get their audience to move with them online is to make their online version better than their offline version. Their online version has to be, I would say, even significantly, is not to state it adequately. Their online version has to be much, much, much better than their offline version. Otherwise, they will not get their audience to move online. And they're not at this point. None of them. The TV stations are not, and the newspapers are not getting their offline audience to move online. And that's primarily because they're not offering enough difference. They're not offering enough more on their websites. And yet they have the capability, because of that almost infinite amount of space you have on the internet. They have the capability of offering so much more, and they're not. They're not doing it, or even if it's there, they're not facilitating their audience's access to additional information that is there. For example, they have lots of past stories. Now, Jim Polk said very few people will look at past stories. As he was talking about, my question was, the idea that if you miss something with video, it's gone. Now, in the story itself, as he said earlier, you can go back and reread a paragraph if you don't catch it the first time. You can't do that when you record your TV news or whatever and listen to it again, but most people don't. So if you miss it in TV, it's gone. If you miss some important content in a newspaper, you go back and reread it. And so that's an advantage. But he was saying, on the other hand, to think that people go back and read your newspaper stories a day later or a week later is probably delusional. In the daily newspaper, in fact, as a weekly newspaper editor and publisher, I would make a big deal out of this, because actually a weekly newspaper is read better than a daily newspaper, in the sense that if somebody's subscribing to a weekly newspaper, or has at least a habit of reading that weekly newspaper, they will keep it in their house longer than a daily newspaper because they're in the habit of not wanting to keep a whole bunch of extra newspapers around, and so the daily newspaper comes in one day and it's out by the next morning. It's gone because a new newspaper is coming in, and so it's very. They've done scientific studies of it, and weekly newspapers are kept in the home and read by more people, read over a longer period of time. So I made a big deal of that when I was selling advertising for a weekly publication, as opposed to the daily paper that the ads they would. First off, and the other thing is that they don't read them as well. Somebody gets the newspaper at 7 in the morning. They're sitting down for breakfast. They spend 10 minutes looking through the newspaper as they're eating breakfast, and they may not come back to it ever. And in fact, right now we're seeing that one of our latest pieces of data suggested that the people are spending like 5 minutes on their newspaper nowadays. Five, I can't remember what it's five, but anyways, verifies and maybe emphasizes that it's even less than it was before. If they're spending 5 to 10 minutes, they're above average. They may be above average with the daily newspaper. And so they're spending so little time with the daily newspaper. What are the chances they're going to read an ad in that paper? They're skimming through it so rapidly to find what they want in the newspaper. They're not paying much attention to the advertising. Now there are exceptions to that, but again, as a weekly newspaper publisher, I would emphasize that difference. Weekly newspapers stayed around longer. They were more local. They had better readership, and they were not thrown away as soon. But anyways, going back to what I was talking about with the online, I think it's kind of odd that with almost infinite amount of space to put your stories, we don't. The media are not doing it. And I think that's one of the failures of traditional media is that they're not figuring out how to add material to their websites that will make their websites of more value than their traditional product. So again, just emphasizing, TV viewers have only that one chance to hear a story, and so one of the things he was talking about was how you have to learn to articulate better. You may have to take a little bit more time and give emphasis to certain words in order to get people to keep listening, and to make sure that it's very clear to people. Because if you speak fast and you speak monotone and you do like some people do in their presentations in class and so forth, it's gone. People are not going to hear it the first time, and they can't hear it a second time unless they're recording and having to. And so the presentation, as Jim Polk found out, was so important. He already had a naturally deep voice, but he had to learn how to present in a way that people would follow and want to listen to him tell the story. He talked about several of the stories that he had worked on, Watergate, where that led to or actually didn't get to impeachment of Richard Nixon ultimately, but it would have, and so he resigned. And that, by the way, was, as far as we know, it was a cover-up, that he was not involved in the dirty tricks that some of his followers were doing, but he did find out and covered it up, and ultimately resigned because he thought he might be impeached. Well, not just he would have been impeached, but whether or not he would have been thrown out of office, nobody will ever know. Bill Clinton, years later, definitely, I mean, he had a number of charges against him, and many of them were almost indisputable. He had lied under oath, for example. It was indisputable. And there were other charges that were similarly accepted by everybody. But that by the time the impeachment is done by the House and then the trial is held by the Senate in America, even the Republicans decided it wasn't worth convicting him. And so he finished his second term in office. Again, some of the others he talked about, Abscam was an FBI sting operation that took place in the late 70s and early 80s, where they caught prestigious businessmen and some uh, members of Congress and others taking bribes. Jonestown was a very sad situation where a religious leader kind of had people brainwashed, and he took them to South America, and he had committed a bunch of crimes, and ultimately um, he got them to poison themselves, and so 913 people died um, at his request. Kind of a great tragedy, and anyway, so he worked on that story, a number of other stories. But what he was leading to ultimately, and I turned off the video before that basically every story should be exciting. And if you're not excited, he says, even if you're standing out in the rain all night, waiting to get waiting for somebody to come out of their house to talk to the press, somebody under investigation or something, if you're not excited about that, then maybe you're in the wrong career. But ultimately, the most frustrating part, he said, was that if you can't find the truth. One of the things he said related to that was that he did not find, and I would agree with him totally. We talked before, a lot of the liberal professors have written in textbooks and have said that they thought being part of a corporation destroyed the purity of the newspapers and so forth. And while that may have, in fact, recently there's more of that charge coming up that some of the corporations are making determined, but I don't think it's that much difference from. I still argue that the biggest impact is the orientation of the employees, not who owns the newspaper or the TV station. But anyway, he said that most stories are not killed by advertisers or publishers or whatever. They're killed by the reporters themselves who just give up on them. Stories can be very difficult, and if you some he thinks are killed prematurely. That if they had kept working on it, they could have found something, but they gave up on them too soon. In other cases, though, you have to recognize that you're just not going to get the story. It's just you don't have access to all the information you need to reach a conclusion, to find the truth. But ultimately said that as far as changing public opinion, I think that this quote is being tested right now. That the only way to change public opinion is to give them facts. I'm not sure, again, with the propaganda, with the inoculation theory of propaganda, we will find out if that's true, because I think at least there are some who are trying to change public opinion without the facts at the current time. Another thing he said was that a lot of people say is that news, that the media they kind of try to hype stories or distort reality with their news coverage, and I'd say there is some truth to that, in the sense that you're going to give, people are interested in stories that have the most impact on them. So it's not that the media are always trying to get them upset, but it's by their choice. You give them a certain set of stories that they want to read. You're adapting your content to the desires of your audience, and so it's not so much that you're forcing something down their throats that they don't want. If they didn't want it, they would be going someplace else. But they actually do want the sort of stuff that the media is giving them. And he gives the example of visiting his great aunt or something, and his aunt was telling her, telling him about stuff going on in the little town where they lived, and that little stuff kind of matched the sort of stuff that goes on, that goes into the media. Some sex scandal, some corruption in local government, some, who was arrested and so forth. She kind of went down the list of all the latest gossip in town, and that gossip pretty much mirrored the sort of stuff that goes into the media. So it's kind of the stuff you talk to your neighbor about over the backyard fence. And in fact, he suggests that's how you should think about how to write your story, is not to get too. It kind of goes back to where I try to teach people to tell your story very simply. That doesn't mean you don't. You want to tell it powerfully, but simply. Use shorter sentences and easier words, because you want to tell your story pretty much like you would tell it to your neighbor. You wouldn't start using real long words just sort of to impress them and so forth. You speak naturally, and so you want to communicate as naturally as possible as you're working as a journalist. And I find it's true even with my academic writing that the simpler I write, the better the results are. Okay, well, I'll finish that. Okay, so your quiz today is not really a quiz; it's more of an assignment. But I'm going to count it as your quiz. I'm also going to give it 3 points, worth 3 points. So if you missed, for example, those who missed last week, if they don't want to take the quiz, they can make up the difference because this is worth 3 quizzes. So I'll be dropping some of your worst quizzes. I can't remember what the total is supposed to be worth. I can't remember what we decided, 10 points or something. So there were already going to be some, I think already going to be some dropped anyway. So just your best scores are going to be counted. So this assignment would be worth three quizzes. So what I'm going to have you do on this is to each of you review 3 of the videos of 3 of your peer groups. So let me, I'll read it here. Your assignment is to score the 3 video projects following yours in the Excel spreadsheet. We'll go through this to explain a little bit in a second. Using the critique sheet provided. If your project is at or near the bottom, you would then go up to the top and back up to the top. You will, I will grade your 3 points is great based on on how well you critique those 3 videos that you watch. And so I'm not critiquing. So this 3 points is not critiquing your video or critiquing their videos. It's critiquing your critique of the videos. Got it? So if you do a good job of critiquing the videos, then you get 3 points. If you don't, if it's kind of mediocre, you'll get 2 points. And if it's pretty bad, you're probably just going to get 1 point, presuming you finish it. So let me just go on, for example. Okay, so the critique sheet will look, I made it into Word so you can download it and do your critique on your keyboard. So you don't have to write out by hand. Maybe easier for you and easier for me to read if you do it this way. So this is a Word document that you can download. So you would go there and download it and open it up and fill in the blanks for the 3 videos you watch. I go back out to okay, so where are we? Okay, so here's the critique sheet. Again, you would just click on that. That would download itself. You would open it up and do one for each of the videos you critique. The videos, of course, are 20 minutes long, so you're basically spending an hour watching the 3 videos and some time critiquing them. So you will take a look. you'll put down the name of the project you're critiquing. You will put down your name. You're the critiqued by. The first item is the quality of the script. I'm not going to actually download all the scripts for you to read, but you will determine the script by listening to it. So that should be adequate. Quality of the visuals that they're using, quality of the audio, including the narration, quality of the content used from the IRE presentation, so how they're using that. And we're going to listen to a couple of these during class, and we'll analyze them by this. We'll talk about it based on this so you get an idea of how I would critique it. Technical integration of all the elements and the overall effect of it. And so you add those up. And again, the last one here, the overall effect is worth 25 points. The other items are 15. Add up right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times 15 should be 25, and the last one's worth 25. And there is room here for you to give comments. I would presume that those who are going to get 3 points will have made some comments on their critique sheet, showing that they actually watched it. So you'll do one of these, fill out one of these for each of the videos that you critique. I'll close that. And then this is the list of the projects. So we'll go back here so that you are for sure understand. Now there's 3 of these. I could not find your YouTube link. If you will send those to me, then I'll put them on here and reload this. If you're supposed to be critiquing one of these that has a question mark, maybe you know these people and you can get a hold of them yourself. I will update this as soon as I get these the URL for them. So those of you that have a question mark by yours, please just, in fact, even right now, if you can, email them to me so I can update this as soon as I leave class. So obviously the first group here, they'd be critiquing the next 3. So they would critique item 2, 3, and 4. And group 2 would be critiquing videos from 3, 4, and 5. You understand that? Where if we go down here, down the bottom, group 15, they would be critiquing items which? 1, 2, and 3. Okay, they're going back up the top. So group 15 would be critiquing the videos for groups 1, 2, and 3. Understand that? So you critique whatever group you're in. You're going to critique 3 videos, which actually means that every video is going to be critiqued by approximately 10 people or more, up to 12 people, because they're being critiqued by the 3 people ahead of above them, so to speak, are going to be critiquing there. So you're going to get the critique of about a dozen people, which will help you understand what you did well and so forth. And I'm going to critique your critiques. Any questions on that assignment? So that's going to be your quiz for the day, worth 3 quizzes. If you've not done real well on some of your quizzes, you can make up for those by doing well on this. It'll be a value to you too. I want to encourage you to watch some videos. We will watch a few of them in class, and so there may be a little bit of redundancy, but I will watch a few of them today and talk about them and bring up the critique sheet and show you how I would critique them or how you think you would critique them. We'll talk about it. We're not going to do 3 in a row. We'll pick and choose around, through this so that we're not helping any one group. But we may watch one of the videos that you will be critiquing possibly by jumping through the list here a little bit. Again, any questions? So again, hopefully that's explained adequately on Moodle. And you have, well, this is on Moodle, so you can pull this up yourselves on Moodle. So it's already there under week 10. So this on week 10, it's already on week 10 as well as the critique sheet, and the assignment is all under week 10 of our. I probably talked too much about politics. The run-of-the-mill story in most in at least most non-national, non-international newspapers, as has nothing to do with politics. If it does, again, local politics is very different than national politics. I think I mentioned the other day that a person, a person who considers himself by American standards a conservative, part of the philosophy of the conservative is that most programs should be run by the local government, not the national government. So a conservative might be wants very low taxes by the national government, but might favor higher taxes by the local government because the local government is closer to the people and may do things that the local citizens may understand their needs better and may need to tax a little more at the local level in order to give them the things that they need at that local level, schools and libraries and swimming pools and whatever else that they want in their community, things that affect them very directly. So when we talk about conservative and liberal in American politics, a conservative related to the federal government may be considered a liberal when it comes to the local government and be totally consistent in their thinking. I think when I was in city council, I found that difficult to. So, a lot of my conservative friends thought I was too liberal on the local city council. They had become so used to being anti-tax on everything, they didn't understand the difference that a conservative and federal politics can be a liberal in a sense, because you spend money locally, all of your citizens have very direct access to whatever it is that you're building or doing. And so that's not a bad thing if you're getting direct benefits from it. And if your local people want it. And so I might put something on the ballot, might propose something to the ballot that might cost people a little bit of money, but we at the local level we are able to put that on a ballot and let the people vote on it. Do you want this new library? Are you willing to pay for this new library? Are you willing to pay for this new swimming pool? Are you willing to pay for this or whatever? And let them decide whether or not it was worth it to them to do. And so even though I'm a conservative and I want a tight budget, I mostly want a tight budget with the federal government. So think kind of when you're looking with, even when you're talking about politics, it will change depending on which politics you're talking about. And in fact, the city council that I ran for, we did not even identify ourselves with any political party. It was by definition, the city council was nonpartisan. So if you wanted to find out whether they're Republican or Democrat, you had to go kind of back channel to find out. It was not going to be on the ballot because they did not consider that pertinent, whether they were which party they were part of. In some of those sorts of races, I thought it was pertinent, but nonetheless, that was the decision of the local government that they would not be on the ballot. And of course, you have all sorts of other things that you're reporting on. I've done reports on with one of the cities I was involved with. They were getting a lot of leakage in their sewer system. And so they were going to put TV cameras down their sewer system to find the leaks and try to plug the holes in them. Well, how do you politicize or bias that? But that's not something it's going to cost money to put the TV camera down the sewage. On the other hand, how many people want sewage leaking out into their, outside of the pipes? So, it's hardly a political issue. Let's say, I did a story on, I may have mentioned alcoholics, homeless alcoholics that were selling their blood in order to buy their alcohol in Tampa, Florida. And one of them died of pneumonia because he had sold his blood too much. And so I went down to interviewed these, you might call them, in America, we might call them bums, people that, had no jobs, just lived, they were homeless. As I mentioned, most of the people that were doing this were all alcoholics. And again, they were selling their blood in order to buy their alcohol. And it was not good for their health, clearly. And the organizations buying their blood did not have a good system for determining if somebody was selling their blood too often and endangering their lives. Well, how's that a political issue? Not hardly a political issue. Certainly sports, local sports is not a political issue. Um, your tips on what to cook for Christmas, it's not a political issue. Um, there's all sorts of things that don't get into politics at all, but you still, let's go back, there may be two sides to the story nonetheless. And it's your job to try to figure out those two sides of the story. If there are two sides, in a lot of cases, you can't find another side. It's just a story. And so so sometimes I know I overemphasize the problem of bias and gatekeeping and source selection and stuff like that, because that in everyday reporting is not the most common problem. It's just writing well and doing your job well. Okay, so I'm going to skip down. I'm going to go ahead and open this one on the ethics of sourcing. And we can watch that one, and you can think about that. I would challenge you to speak up and tell me what you think. You're kind of shy about that, and I don't want to. I don't know, maybe if we're going to watch some, I will give you some of my opinion. I guess I need to so that you know what I'm looking for. So let's go back to this last one. I will make a few comments. I did find that I found this sort of graphic hard to. I found it causing in me a conceptual conflict or a cognitive conflict to try to follow the developing graphic at the same time as trying to listen to the audio. Now, part of that may have been because I was struggling with the audio a little bit. Part of that is accent, having trouble following the accent a little bit. I think the narrator was dropping her voice a little bit at times, and so I was having a hard time. Also, I have bad hearing, so maybe just trying to find it distinctive enough. I think there was some background music, maybe conflicting with it at times. One of the things that I've learned as a bilingual migrant education as one of my jobs. One of the things they taught us there is that I remember one presenter was trying to explain the problem principle when you're narrating your videos. Make sure you're that you're enunciating very well, because you don't want the listener. You probably struggled some with Jim Polk, probably because he has a very deep voice, and I couldn't. I probably in making the transition from an audio tape into a digital format, you probably lost some quality, but also the frequency of his voice was maybe going below the common frequency. So you had a hard time understanding Jim Polk. So it's a very good example, if you were, because you were probably missing 10 to 20% of the words. So when we're struggling with whether it be an accent or somebody dropping their voice too low, or talking too fast, anything like that will cause this loss of 10 to 20% of the words. And if you lose 20% of the words, you have a hard time following what's being said. And so you have to be very careful with your audio in maybe slowing it up a little bit. Be very careful with the enunciation. I thought the narration was very natural. I liked how naturally she's a good, presented in a very natural way. But I think I lost somewhere in this range of the words. Again, part of it was just that I come from a different part of the world. And so obviously that's nobody's fault, but it's a reality that I had some trouble following. So especially if you're going to do any work internationally, you have to be really careful in trying to make sure, slow down your speed maybe a little bit. It's just like Jim Polk was saying, you have to learn how to enunciate differently, to emphasize key words. and speak a little bit differently than how most of us do speak. If you're going to be narrating or video. Um, I don't know the problems I had. I thought, I mean, it was done well. Like I said, because and the two problems I found were interrelated because I was struggling to understand everything by not having a more of a PowerPoint type presentation, having the writing as it went. I was trying to follow and listen, and that cognitive conflict made it worse. If the words had just been up there, and I was listening, and I was seeing the bullet points up there, then I could have concentrated a little more in listening, and not been trying to watch and listen at different things because what I was watching did not always sync with what I was hearing. And so that's the problem with this developing. It's cool, it looks cool, it's clever, and it can be a problem as far as trying to sync what you're watching and what you're listening to if you're struggling with either one of them. Now, if you're not struggling with any of the audio, if the audio is very clear, then you're probably not going to have trouble with this sort of graphics. But if you're struggling at all to understand the audio and you're having to try to follow this developing graphic, then you have a double problem that comes up. Okay, so I'm going to jump down and talking about ethics. I'm going to go ahead. Well, let's take a break. Let's take 10. Well, some of you are taking your time. You're going out on your own, I guess. In fact, well, I'm just go ahead and turn it on. If you need to take a break, you can go out and use the bathroom, whatever you need to do. I'm just going to turn it back on because people seem to be going in and out as they want to anyway. So I'll turn it on. Not relevant. Anyway, so so clarity is the most important thing, but being natural is also important. So with the narrators, this one, I might downgrade them a little bit for not being as natural as the first one was. But in most cases, not always, not throughout. It was somewhat inconsistent. Some were about the volume was about right. Some of the volume was low. Some of the volume was a little bit blurry. I noticed in one that I was watching in my office. We probably won't watch that one here, but somebody was in a room where there was a lot of echo. You have to be careful with echo. And so the volume was right, but the echo was such that it was hard to follow the speaker just from the echo. I know the narrator of the one I'm talking about that we're not watching here well enough to know she speaks clearly, but there was so much echo in the room, I was having trouble following it. So the setup, you need to test your environment as well and make sure that you're coming across right. So this one, anyway, they're not as natural as with the first video, but I could follow it better, a little bit slower, a little enunciated, a little bit clearer. Do check. If you're not sure about how to pronounce a word, you might ask somebody who's is a native speaker, or try to find the word. I'm trying to think if Google actually pronounces it clearly or pronounces it properly. I'd go try it. But anonymous, for example, was not quite pronounced properly. So I had to. It was pronounced often enough, and it was on the screen enough that I could understand what she was saying, even if it wasn't pronounced quite right. But if it had been a word used less often, I wouldn't have understood it the first couple of times because it's just a little different in tone, as you all know. Just a little bit of different wrong pronunciation can leave you misunderstanding a word. I struggle with that a lot with my wife because she's from Kazakhstan, and so she's trying to tell me something, and she comes to pronounces a word, and I have no idea what she's saying until she shows it to me. She'll have to find it, show me something that's printed or something, so I understand what she's saying, because it's there, but the pronunciation is such I just can't understand her. Obviously, if you're trying to do something in a language that's not your first language and so forth, try to make sure you have the pronunciation right. Check the bigger words and the most important words. Anonymous was very important to this video, and the pronunciation wasn't quite on. But again, because of the text on the screen and the frequency that it was spoken, it was it wasn't hard to follow for that reason. Even though if I just listened to the word, there were times when I had, what's that word she's saying? And I had, I'd look up and, oh yeah, that's it. So the audio in this case was, again, there were some different volumes. Some really soft. I had to listen carefully because it was too soft. Then it got blurring a little bit. It started off really about perfect. One of the speakers spoke a little faster. I'm presuming it was a different speaker. The voices were pretty similar, so I wasn't always sure how many narrators there were there. But at least part of the narration was faster, and I had to listen a little closer. But all the narration the enunciation was a little better than with the first video we watched, although not as natural. And so they both are part of narration, is trying to be as natural as possible, which the first one was quite natural, but make sure the enunciation is clear, because if you don't understand it, it doesn't matter how natural it is. There were in this one, I think, the transitions like from the student's presentation and the presentation for the audio presentation. Sometimes there was a little bit of a long wait between in the transition, so to speak, a little awkward in transitions, relating more to the technical integration, I would say. Just to discuss a little bit about the content, because it's not just about this also about content. Let me go back to that first one. With some narrative sort of formats, when we talk about narrative, we usually are saying that we're not using inverted pyramid. That's typically what we're saying when we talk about narrative formats of news writing. Most stories are not narrative. Most stories are inverted pyramid. It mentioned in that first one that sometimes you might be actually building to a little bit of a surprise ending. And so you have to be a different type of, there are people who specialize in narrative writing. It becomes a little more like writing a novel. It mentioned using dialogue and so forth. That's the whole, that is very much like fiction writing. If you're going to start trying to implement dialogue, then you're talking about, more of a fiction approach to writing. I mentioned Truman Capote, who took a very small story about the killing of a family in the Kansas prairie, a farm in Kansas, and made it into a 700 or 800 page book. Based all of it on interviews and facts, but he did make up dialogue. He wrote In Cold Blood, was the name of the book, very much like a novel, and so he was making up dialogue in his case. So it's kind of what they call sometimes new journalism, although he wrote that in the 1970s, so it's not exactly new. But of adding some fictional elements to it, in that there's no way he could know the dialogue that went on in the house when the family was killed and stuff like that. There's no way he could know that. He did get to interview the killer, and so he could have, get a little bit of an idea, but obviously not verbatim quotes from a killer he talked to. I think it was over a year later before he had a chance to interview the killer. Spent many hours with the killer in prison talking to him. So he did the best that he could, but obviously the dialogue was not perfect dialogue. it almost sounded like this the person being interviewed or making the presentation in that for that first video was he's in trying to create dialogue. It sounds like you're you might be asking somebody what was the dialogue like, but that person is also doing it by memory. If you're reporting on something that happened, for example, let's say you in this current setting where the Democrats are trying to impeach President Trump, some of the stuff is coming out from anonymous sources, kind of combining these two videos we've been watching. Um, some of it is coming from anonymous sources. Um, if you were to create that into a narrative, you would ask those sources to kind of recreate. And in fact, in some cases, it has happened in the hearings they've had before Congress. They've asked people to kind of tell them exactly what was said. Well, it's probably since it happened, since what they were telling about was a couple of months ago, what they said was probably not exactly what was said. They're recreating the dialogue, but it probably was not exact. But as a journalist, you can ask somebody to recreate a dialogue for you. You should attribute, unless you're Truman Capote and writing a novel, novelizing a true story. You should probably let people know that this is the dialogue according to the source. This is what was said. But anyway, narrative writing is different than the inverted pyramid, and inverted pyramid is not the only type of writing style. But as I've explained for those that have taken my editing class, inverted pyramid is essential for most newspaper stories because newspaper stories are done so fast. I mean, the whole publication is done so fast. You're putting together in larger newspapers the equivalent of a novel in one day. You have enough stories that it's equivalent to a full novel, but it's made up of maybe 100 stories, and you have to make those stories fit onto pages, and you write the headlines, you have to put in some graphics. If the graphics aren't big enough, then it's boring graphically. So you want to make sure you have good sized graphics, but you only have somebody. If I'm as the wire editor at the paper, if I give somebody, okay, I want these 3 stories on this page, it has these ads on it, and use this photo. Well, they're going to end up having to cut lots of stuff from the stories, and if they're not written in inverted pyramid style, it's going to be a very time consuming effort to try to cut down stories not written in inverted pyramid. And so by necessity, newspapers almost have to be written in inverted pyramid style, the way they're produced in modern days, except with a few exceptions that might go in the feature section. For example, every day we have in the daily I was at, we had every week, or excuse me, every day we had 4 sections, and one section was the feature section. It would feature different things. So one on Wednesdays when we had grocery store ads, it would have something to do with food. On Fridays, when we were pushing for entertainment that was going to happen during the weekend, when people had some free time, then the feature section had to do with entertainment, what's coming into town, and so forth. On Thursdays, there was a business feature on the front page of that 4th section. On Sunday, it was just whatever they found that was most interesting. Could very well be in narrative format because they had time to work on that feature section. The feature editor didn't have a lot of other duties other than that feature section, so she could handle cutting a narrative story. And if she was writing it, she could write it as she chose. So narrative and certain situations is fine, but it doesn't work with a newspaper deadline on a consistent basis. But narrative approach, it can be very effective. It can be more like fiction writing, even if it's just a short story, even if it's just it's almost by definition a narrative story is going to be longer than a regular news story, because of the description, because of the detail. But even if it's, say, 30 paragraphs, that's a relatively short narrative story. It is told more like a fiction story. And so it's not, it's interesting. I've mentioned, I think, maybe not in this class, but other classes, a story about a crime, for example, even just a simple crime or an accident. If you can get some of those details and tell it like a narrative story, then it can be very powerful, because you do have the makings of a novel. Basically, you have some action, you have something, a bad guy and a good guy, and all this sort of stuff. You have the makings of like I said, of a fiction story when you're talking about crime or accidents and stuff like that. That if you get the detail you need, you can make a very strong narrative story out of it. Anyway, going back to the topic of the anonymous sources, particularly anonymous sources, a couple of items I wanted for content wanted to mention. There have been some discussion, or some evidence that there has been some bribery of some of the reporters, related to the Get Trump efforts, and that is, if you have that sort of thing, that is despicable, from a journalistic perspective. If you have, I think the bigger with that incident, with relating to Trump, the bigger problem is that you have so many anonymous sources. Almost all the stories that the liberal newspapers are writing have anonymous sources in them. All of them, when it relates to Trump, because you're dealing with people that are, in many cases, breaking the law by revealing classified information that they're not allowed, that they don't have permission to release to the press, and so they could be fired. On the one hand, that can be justified because that's why you protect somebody's identification, because they could be fired. That's how you justify it. But the other problem is if as I mentioned, about 90% of the bureaucracy voted for Hillary, then how much can you trust what they're saying if they hate the person if they, as a unified body, hate the person they're talking about, they're releasing illegally information about? And there's been a lot of stories released that have never been proven to be true. So they release stuff to try to make President Trump look bad, but they don't have any way of verifying it. And then over time, you find out what happened to that story. If it was true, why couldn't they ever prove it or come up with more evidence? And they never have. So you have a bunch of very questionable, literally hundreds of questionable stories, that either have been false or at least so skewed out of proportion that they could never be followed up on, never substantiated in any way, over a period of more than a year, more than 2 years, more like 3 years. They're still not substantiated. So they were claims, but were they valid claims? The recent hearings in the House, before a House committee, have found very similar things. They've had people testifying that they don't like what Trump did in his dealings with Ukraine, but when they actually pinned him down and said, "Did you yourself hear anything that the president said that you felt was illegal or unethical?" And they themselves didn't know. They were quoting. They had the impression from other people in the bureaucracy that he was doing something wrong. And so they were quoting people who, more than hearsay, is hearsay of hearsay of hearsay. And so these were very smart people that, like an ambassador, and people like that. When the Republicans finally pinned them down, they had no personal evidence. They had witnessed nothing themselves. They heard something from somebody else, who heard something from somebody else, that heard something from somebody else. In other words, the whole bureaucracy is a big rumor mill, and they're reporting rumors of rumors of rumors that nobody can substantiate. And it's become kind of a bizarre situation. Um, as far as what they're talking about, paying a source, um, there are subtle things like when I interviewed the alcoholics, the homeless alcoholics, about their selling their blood. I bought them a hamburger. That's how I bribed them. They were hungry. I didn't want to give them money because they just go buy alcohol with it. But I took them there was a little food joint there, a little restaurant. I bought them a hamburger if they would talk to me and tell me what was going on, and they did very happily. So it cost me, like, in those days, like 25 cents for a hamburger or something. So I'm not sure that would be considered a bribe. And they had no reason to lie to me. In fact, they had reason to lie to me to the contrary, because what I was reporting was that they were endangering their own lives by the fact that there was no system to check on how often they gave their blood. And so, if anything, my reporting would hurt them because they would not be allowed to sell their blood as often, therefore not be able to buy the alcohol they wanted to buy as often. So, in that sense, it was hurting them it might keep them from doing what they wanted to do, which was sell their blood too often and buy too much alcohol. But I don't think that's what they're talking about when they're talking about, bribing people. That's hardly a bribe. I mentioned I've taken government officials out for a nice long lunch and spent 2 hours with them, talking to them. I don't think that's a bribe. If you're out buying expensive drinks, I mean, I don't drink alcohol, so I certainly never bought anybody alcohol. And so if you're taking somebody out and getting them drunk or whatever, that's going a little far. That's further than I would go. But certainly you'd be some of the less reputable publications do pay sources a substantial amount sometimes to get the stories they want, and then you do have to question the validity of those stories if they pay very much. With any anonymous source, you have to question the motive, and that's what I'm talking about with this current Trump situation. Is there's clear motive, is that there's a very strong anti-Trump movement in America, made up mostly of the segments of society that I've talked about, um, between the journalists, the professors, the bureaucracy, the Hollywood bunch, the Democrats. But they represent about half of the population, and the other half are conservative that support Trump. So it's kind of not exactly half and half. There's a middle independent piece in the middle, so it might be 40-40, and then 20% independents that will decide the future election. Um, but the conservatives and the liberals are pretty evenly split. But you don't hear as much from the conservatives because they don't own newspapers, and they're not professors, and they're not Hollywood stars, and they're not a lot of things that the Democrat backers are. So you can get a very one-sided story, and if you're making your sources at this time, the bureaucrats in the government, they are very anti-Trump. So you have to question their motives. If you can, you want to verify the facts, but that's the problem with anonymous sources, is that very frequently there's no way. If it was easy to verify the facts, then you wouldn't even need you wouldn't need the anonymous sources. If you could find documents instead of quoting an anonymous source, then you would use the documents, for example. But with too many anonymous sources, there are no other sources. Otherwise, you shouldn't be using them. You should not use anonymous sources if you can find other sources, because you always have to question their motive to some degree. I've mentioned before, and maybe I can find it here real quick. Um, Not sure. Got a lot of windows here open. Um, I had to scan this in multiple pieces, but here's a part of the. This is Janet Cook. I Some of you, I may have mentioned her even in this class. I don't remember, but anyway, she won the Pulitzer Prize. Um, and then they found out that she just made up that she not only didn't she claimed she had anonymous sources. The truth was she had no sources. She was making up the interviews. Um, she ran a series of stories about children living in the poor part of Washington D.C. and living among the drug dealers and the violence in those communities and stuff like that. And she would have gotten away with it, except she's somewhat of a chronic liar, and so she had also lied on her CV. And Associated Press found two different versions of her CV that were different. And so once they realized that she was lying about other things, then they had to be thinking that she might lie about her stories as well. So they then had to question her anonymous source. If she was, like I say, if she's a chronic liar, then so I interviewed her editor, and he said how hard it was to bring her in and grill her. They really liked her, but she was a rising star to them, and she won the top prize in America in her journalism. But when they finally put her under some pressure, she confessed, and her excuse was, well, there's kids like this throughout. I made a composite of kids that I know. Well, in other words, she just, yeah, the fact that she knew people that were like this kid that she claimed she'd interviewed is not an excuse. It was a lie. Everything was fiction, basically, based on her life experience. That may be true, but it's still fiction. All fiction is based on somebody's life experience. Usually, the best fiction, anyway, somebody can get into and express the feelings more strongly, anyway, if it has somehow relates to their life experience. And so that's not a good excuse for a journalist. So she was caught and disgraced and probably never worked again as a journalist after that, even though her writing and she was capable of being a journalist, but she not ethically capable, I guess you could say. In one of the current parts of the current anti-Trump hearings that are going on, um, it's been particularly um, if the Republican can prove it. I'm not sure they can, but they're allegedly anyway. One thing they can prove is that the head of the hearings has been caught lying about his relationship or his knowledge of the original source that launched the hearings. And he at first said that they didn't know the person at all, and then reporters found out that the original source had talked to his staff. And then he claimed that he didn't know who it was at all, but then he stopped some of the witnesses from talking about certain things because he was afraid it was going to expose the source. But how could he know it was going to expose the source if he didn't know who the source was? And now the alleged source, who's never denied being the source, but one of the publications revealed who they were sure was the source, and that person, like I said, has not denied it. It turns out that he's friends with other people who have tried to get Trump on other times and created false information about him, and that he's somebody that actually worked with somebody on the chairman of the kind of the prosecutor in the case with his staff before and other things. A lot of things coming out that looked very bad about that source, which is the problem with anonymous sources. Can you trust them? And can it blow up in your face, make you look like an idiot? So you have to be careful with that. Okay, there was a couple of things that people have asked. Let me address those questions. First off, I would like, there's so many people in this class that I would like hard copies and stuff because I just don't try to print them out myself. And it is easier for me to grade things in hard copy form. So on project 2, yes, I do want a hard copy. Even though I put December 1st as the deadline, I think if you look at the on Moodle, if you actually click on it, it says like it's Monday morning, and you can push if you're going to deliver. The hard copy can be a day later than that. I don't really care too much about giving you another day or something with a hard copy. Do upload your soft copy by Monday morning. And if I'm not in my office, there's enough of a gap between the door and the floor that you can push your hard copy underneath the door. I'll look for that when I come into my office. I won't jump all over them. I will, with the quiz, we didn't set a deadline on that with today's activity that you're supposed to be doing. I have no problem with you bringing it to me on, my preference would be for you to bring it to me on Friday and bring it hard copies. Go ahead and fill out those sheets and bring them on Friday. Yeah, you should be able to do that because, like I say, if you listen to 3 of them, that's 1 hour of listening. And I haven't given you a lot of homework. I've given you big, fairly big assignments, but not a lot of assignments. So try to get those in by a week from today. Listen to those three presentations that you've been assigned, and fill out the critique sheets for those, and just hand those in on next Friday. So we can look at those in hard copy form. Any questions? Other questions? Please ask your questions in class so that I get a lot of questions by email, and then I have to answer by email, and I get so much email. I've got altogether something like 150, 160 students this semester, and so I'm getting a lot of email, and it's hard for me to keep up with everything. So please, if you have questions, please, my preference is please ask them here, and let me answer your questions so that I don't get a whole bunch of emails. So any other questions that I can answer on anything at all? Looking forward, I hope I answered all your questions about Project 2. Again, it is to be written in APA style, so I sent you or uploaded some APA short guides that aren't too hard to follow for those who haven't learned APA style yet. That is the style that you'll be, for those that haven't started their thesis work, that is what you'll be using for your thesis. So it's a good thing to start using now. So there are, like I said, I've uploaded some little short guides and stuff for that. And I'm not going to be real picky, but I mean the general style should be APA. And again, I'm not going to be ultra picky, but I want you to, basically make it APA. With the next one, going to Project 3, which isn't due until January 1st, that one is to be written by AP style. And I believe I did upload the AP style book. AP style, being Associated Press style, is basically the international style of journalistic writing. For those that took editing from me, we tried to review that as part of the editing class. Within my crash course, I have some of the essentials in there. But the main thing, again, I'm not going to be real picky with that. If you're quoting something in journalistic style, if you're writing journalistically, you can cite an academic source, but there are never footnotes in journalism style. So whatever you have to say about a source, you have to say in the text itself, and typically without parentheses. Typically, according to. By the way, that word "according to," that attribution, technically that should be a non-human source, a non-human attribution. A human says or writes or somehow communicates, and use an appropriate verb for that. But according to, typically, editors are saying that according to should be like a website or a book or an academic article, whatever. So this would be, according to, would be more frequently be a non-human source. And even then, of course, once you introduce that non-human source, then you can go to other verbs depending what that source is. If it's a written source, which it typically would be a text source, then sometimes in English we use the word says even with text. Obviously, text doesn't say in a human sense, but the text says da da da. It's sometimes that, but reads is more appropriate. But that's again why you say according to da da da. You can quote it. So your third one will be in journalistic style, preferably when there's a question in AP style. And I believe I already uploaded a copy of the AP style book from 2005, not the most recent, but they don't change a whole lot. If you have a question, you can if you didn't take the editing class from me, the AP style is organized in an alphabetical order. And so, but it also in the back part of the book is a punctuation guide. The table of contents will direct you to it precisely, but it's towards the back of the book. So if it's printed, it's a book, about that thick. Now, probably most journalists, at least at newspapers, would be probably have an electronic version so they can look it up faster. They can do a search and find what they want. But Associated Press is if you don't know, Associated Press is an association of newspapers and TV stations. And to be part of Associated Press, you do pay some money, but you also are obligated to send them your best stories. And so the Associated Press has relatively few employees compared to a press service, to other press services, because they don't write. They have some writers, but by and large, they are just sending out the stories from other association members. And there's thousands of association members, so there's lots of stories to send out. So they have a lot of editors and not as many writers in the Associated Press. So because they want all the stories sent to them in the same style, that's why they have their own style book. They tell all their association members, when you send us your story, it should be in this style. And so that's, again, why they have a style book. Because they get stories from all over the world, and they want them to be consistent. And which is why, because it's the biggest news service, it is the most international of the news services. And the style book that most of them would use. And even when they don't use it directly, like New York Times has its own style book, but it's still mostly Associated Press, and they make a few changes of their own. At the newspaper I was at, they used the AP style book, and then they gave you one page of things that they disagreed with. And so you had like one page of things that were different in the newspaper style than in Associated Press. Chicago Tribune has its own style book, but it's still mostly AP style with a few changes. So it's uh, so even those publications that have their own style book or other organizations, they still pretty much go to AP style and they make changes that they want to make. The And I'll just wrap up with just taking a look at Project 3 real quick to see if I can anticipate any problems you might have with that project. So, Project 3, write a news story about Professor Ken Harvey's views on how modern Western news media are frequently implementing the inoculation theory of propaganda, intentionally or unintentionally, and what other theories, studies, and real-world examples support or dispute that conclusion. So I certainly have given you lots of quotes. I've also, in the text underneath it, reminded you of some of the people we've referred to, that I've linked to or cited in some of my discussions. But I also mentioned under number 5, Howard Schneider, who I also asked you to listen to his hour-long presentation, and he is definitely represents the other side. He claims there is no systemic problem with bias in the media. And I'm sure you can find others that will say the same thing. So I think that one's pretty clear. Any questions on that one then? So you've got the description here. On both of these, on projects 2 and 3, I listed the criteria here: quality of writing, spelling, grammar, clarity, flow, overall professionalism in your writing. Again, that's going to be slightly different between 2 and 3. But even the way I write, as I've told you before, when I write academically, I try to write as journalistically as I can, because clarity is the most important thing even about academic writing. And so since we're taught as journalists to write clearly, I see no reason not to use journalistic style as much as I can when I write academically. Quality of content, quality of sources, compliance with assigned style, overall effect. You can discuss in your stories, how that happens. Like, again, the selection of stories, selection of sources. One of the sources here, I've written several books on it. One of the people that I mentioned here, up here. I always forget his name. Jim Coopers has looked at it on the use of words. When they use biasing words for the conservatives and neutral words for the liberals, stuff like that. He found a lot of bias in the word selection. You can find bias in the organization of stories. There's lots of places you can find bias, and so there you can find. I'm hoping you can find stuff that I don't have. I've mentioned some sources here, and those are good sources, the best ones I've found so far. But there are probably other sources, and so I will reward those who find new sources, pro or con. But you can do the assignment by just looking at the sources I provided, but you'll be rewarded if you find new sources and bring up new issues on either side. Again, you're not going to be penalized for finding material against my position. I'd love, actually, in some ways, love to be proven wrong, but I don't think you can, because I'd love to be proven wrong because I think democracy is in danger. So I'd rather not have to think that, but I don't think you can prove that to me. But on the other hand, if you find more evidence, and I've mentioned these on some of my PowerPoints that you may have seen in the past. I've there's been lots of surveys done, and so I don't think I didn't bother to list all the surveys that have been done. There's been lots of surveys where journalists have identified themselves as either liberal or conservative, Democrat, Republican, and those have always substantiated my concern. Um, Actually, part of my concern is actually not only that I think it's controlled by the so-called liberals in America, because as I said, liberals are. I think no longer describes the liberals in America, because I think a liberal is by definition should be somebody who's open to ideas. And right now, the liberals on campuses are turning over cars and starting fires and blocking other people they disagree with from talking. You might have seen the other day the first lady went to a high school and she was booed by the high school kids. The high school kids don't know anything about politics. They've been taught by their parents to be very um, it's just not polite. Conservatives never booed Michelle Obama. They that would to conservatives that's just not something that's done. But liberals feel very free to chase people out of restaurants and to boo the first lady and act in ways that's very distasteful and not open-minded at all. And they're teaching their kids to have that sort of attitude. Very seems to me almost fascist um, in their desire to block anything from the conservative side. Anybody, not allow them to talk on campus, not allow them to organize. Their videos on the internet where the college Republicans are trying to, just setting up a booth to have students sign up if they'd like to come to their meetings or whatever, and they suddenly get surrounded by a crowd of leftist students that are yelling and screaming at them and stuff. It's to me very anti-democratic, which in other words is more fascist than anything else. Which is so I think the words are almost flipped. That liberals are not liberal in America right now. They're something else, more like fascist. I'm afraid. My perspective. I know that's so. Whatever you can come up with, whatever evidence you can find on either side is fine with me. Um, but like I said, because I feel it's such an important thing, I decided to use that as one of your assignments. And for this year, next year will be something else. Any other questions? Okay, well, then you can go. Sorry, I kept you over.